So brands like Cafe Ritazza, Upper Crust, Millie's Cookies. We also franchise in a lot of brands and operate them in airports and stations. So the biggest one is probably Marks and Spencer's, Simply Foods brand, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. We operate all those in airports and railway stations in the UK, plus we operate Starbucks and Burger Kings around the world as well. So franchising is very much in the heart of our business. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we operate in the travel sector, which is quite a specific market, and then talk a little bit more generally, I guess, about what's happening in the restaurant industry. So if I look at our business maybe 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the airports were after the big brands. As Ritu said, they couldn't get enough of the Burger Kings and the Starbucks and Costa Coffees, etc. What we're finding more and more now is that a lot of the airports and the railway stations are looking for something very bespoke, something very specific for that location. So if we talk about Chicago O'Hare Airport, for example, 90% of what we've opened, and we've opened probably about 30 stores in the last 12 months, 90% of what we've opened there are unique brands from downtown. So they did not want big multinational brands. They wanted some iconic brands from downtown, whether it's a seafood bar or a coffee shop, etc. And a lot of these were mom and pop brands. They weren't big international brands. And it was very interesting because a lot of these brands actually didn't have a brand manual. Everything was in the owner's head. And so we had to work with them to create a brand manual, a design manual, and then bring them into the airport. So we see a lot of growth in these unique sort of iconic brands coming into the travel sector. One of the other things you need to understand about our business, I guess, is that we work in very small footprints. We don't have big kitchens, we don't have big storerooms, etc. either. So the menus that you may have, for example, downtown, you may have, 500 dishes. That will not work in a travel environment. So we really have to rationalize that menu down to the best sellers. And then once we get that, it works really, really well. The other thing about our business is that getting people is a huge issue, particularly in Europe at the moment. And one of the things we encourage very much is making sure you recruit people with the right attitude. I think typically, historically, I think when we got a CV, first thing we look at is the person's qualifications. Now, qualifications are important, but ultimately, in our industry, in the food industry particularly, having the person with the right attitude can make a huge difference. And we really need to focus a lot more on that. The other thing, again, what I think Ritu echoed earlier on, is that there's a huge demand for artisan brands and unique brands as well. So whether you're a coffee brand, a seafood brand, or a bakery brand, I think artisan concepts are very much in popularity at the moment. If you look in the UK, there's a huge growth in the tapas market. So in Indian food at the moment, in the last probably 2 weeks, I've probably been to 5 or 6 different Indian concepts just in London. And a lot of these are tapas brands, so they're not your traditional fine dining, whilst there's a big demand still for that. There's a brand called Dishum, which I'm sure if you've been to London recently, you would have experienced it. It's making a huge success. I think they've got about 5 or 6 big restaurants in London. They're now opening, I think, their first one in Manchester. But there's a huge trend in Indian tapas brands. So brands like Tandoor Chop House, Lokhandwala, Brigadier, Cricket, all of these 5 years ago didn't exist, and suddenly there's a big explosion, and there's a huge demand for that. So again, people are looking for more experiential Indian dining, or whether it's Spanish dining, etc. So we see a huge demand there. The other thing I think we're seeing a lot more, and I'm sure the same case as India, is this whole trend about local produce and provenance and traceability and organic food as well. So again, a lot of our clients, whether it's an airport or a train station, are demanding more and more supporting the local farmers and the local growers, etc. So we're seeing a lot more organic produce being requested, and full traceability as well. So I think that trend certainly will continue going forward. Street food, again, I think going back 5-10 years ago was suddenly in trend. I don't think that trend is disappearing. Again, Ritu was saying about the trucks, etc. So what we're finding in London particularly is there are street food concepts which last for 3 months. So they find some warehouse space somewhere, they create 10, 20 concepts, and they stay there for 3 months, and then they move on. So this is not something that has longevity, but it's certainly something that has got small, sharp interest, and they move on to another concept. So I think that will certainly will continue. The other big thing, I think, at the moment, if you've read any press in the UK, and sadly somebody passed away recently buying a sandwich from Pret a Manger. And this was again to do with allergens. And I don't know how big the allergen issue is in India, but certainly across Europe, gluten-free is very, very popular. Everywhere you go now, there's definitely something which is gluten-free on the menu, and I'm one of those people who look for that. So again, there's a huge trend, gluten-free, nut-free, dairy-free, etc. So I think if you don't have that in your menu, certainly I think you will find that you're not going to fulfill your complete demand. And veganism in the last 2 to 3 years has become hugely popular. There are vegan-only restaurants opening time after time. The last thing I just want to touch on, and it's a big debate, is this whole issue about food delivered to home. So again, Deliveroo, Uber, and other organizations like that are growing very, very rapidly. And it's a real conundrum, I think, for a lot of businesses as to how they engage with these companies. And it is the future, so you kind of have to work out how you're going to get that whole delivery model working. One of the difficulties, I guess, with these models is that whilst they are a quick win for a lot of companies in terms of getting you some new additional turnover, the key question for me is who owns that customer? It's certainly not that restaurant that owns the customer. So in the future, if you want to improve that customer experience, you're going to be very much relying on these third-party organizations, which have got a huge play in our market. But it's interesting how you engage with them. Now, a lot of companies are certainly working with the likes of Deliveroo and Uber. Some companies are resisting, and some companies have developed their own solutions. So I think you have to really tread very carefully when you go down this path. So that's what was the key items I want to talk about. If I could pass on to perhaps Troy, and then maybe we can take questions afterwards.
Thank you, Sukh. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's really great to be here in New Delhi again this year, attending the Opportunity Summit, along with the Franchise India 2018 Expo. And I'd like to congratulate